want you to think about the last loaf you pulled out of your own oven. Go on, picture it. Maybe the top cracked in a way you didn't expect. Maybe you cut into it, and the inside looked more like a dinner roll that gave up halfway through becoming bread, dense. A little gummy near the bottom, and you stood there in your kitchen, flour on your hands, wondering what in the world you did wrong when you followed the recipe exactly. I know that feeling. I have stood in that exact spot more times than I can count, over more than 50 years of baking bread in my own kitchen. Here's what nobody tells you, dear. It usually isn't you. It's the recipe. Most recipes online are written by people trying to make things sound simple, and in trying to make it sound simple, they leave out the one or two details that actually matter most. The details a real bakery, the kind with a case full of gorgeous crusty loaves and a line out the door, would never leave out, because those details are, in a way, the whole secret of the business. I'm Rosalie Jean. I've been baking bread since I was a young bride in my 20s, taught by my own mother at her kitchen table, and I've spent more years than I like to admit chasing that bakery-style loaf at home, the kind with the shiny, blistered crust and the soft, open inside, the kind that makes your whole house smell like something wonderful is about to happen. I finally figured out how they do it, and today I'm going to hand you 5 of those secrets, free, right here at my own kitchen table, the same way my mother handed hers to me. By the end of this video, you will know exactly why your dough has been fighting you, and you'll know the one specific trick, the temperature trick, that professional bakeries build their entire yeast process around and that almost no home recipe ever mentions. Stick with me all the way through, because near the end I'm going to tell you about a little habit of mine involving a rubber band and a jar that will let you know exactly when your dough is ready, without ever opening the oven door to guess. It sounds silly, it works every time. Let's talk about why any of this matters in the first place. Here is the one thing I need you to understand before anything else, because everything else in this video builds on it. Yeast is alive. Not alive like a person, of course, but alive the way a little seed is alive, or the way your garden is alive in springtime. And because it's alive, it doesn't behave like flour or sugar or salt. Those ingredients just sit there and wait for you. Yeast does not wait. Yeast reacts. It reacts to warmth, it reacts to moisture, it reacts to what's around it, and most of all, it reacts to temperature. Most people treat yeast like a stopwatch problem. They think the recipe says let it rise for 1 hour, so they set a timer for 1 hour, and whatever the dough looks like when that timer goes off, that's what they work with. But a bakery doesn't think about yeast in terms of the clock. A bakery thinks about yeast in terms of the thermometer, because yeast at a warm temperature can do in 30 minutes what yeast at a cool temperature takes 2 hours to do, and yeast at too hot a temperature can die in minutes and do nothing at all, no matter how long you wait. Here's the line I want you to remember, the one you could repeat to a friend at your own kitchen table. Yeast doesn't care about the clock, dear. It cares about the temperature. Once that clicks into place, everything else about bread baking starts to make a lot more sense. Now let's get into the 5 things. The first secret is about the water you use to wake your yeast up, and this is the one bakeries are strictest about because it's the one that decides everything downstream. When you're activating dry yeast or even just mixing it into your dough, the temperature of your water is doing more work than you realize. Too cold, and the yeast stays sluggish, barely stirring, and your whole rise takes forever and sometimes never really gets going at all. Too hot, and I mean really just a little too hot, and you kill it outright. Dead yeast doesn't rise bread. It just sits there in a puddle of flour looking sad. A professional bakery aims for water right around 105 degrees Fahrenheit to 110 degrees Fahrenheit when they're proofing yeast. Not lukewarm from the tap, guessed at by feel. An actual number, checked with an actual thermometer every single time for every single batch. I know that sounds almost too simple to be a secret, but I promise you, it's the difference between a baker who has bread rise reliably every time and a home cook who sometimes gets lucky and sometimes doesn't. I'll tell you a story on myself. Early in my marriage, my husband bought me my first real kitchen thermometer for Christmas, and I laughed because I thought, I've been baking bread since I was a girl. I don't need a little gadget to tell me if water is warm. I used the back of my wrist, the way my mother did, the way her mother did before her, and most of the time, that worked out fine. But every so often, maybe one loaf in 10, my dough just would not rise properly, and I never understood why, because I was doing everything else the same. It wasn't until years later, when I finally used that thermometer out of curiosity, that I realized my wrist test was inconsistent by 10 degrees or more depending on the season, whether my hands were cold from the garden, all sorts of little things. Once I started checking the actual number, that one loaf in 10 stopped failing. It just stopped. So here's where most people go wrong on this one. They eyeball the water, they run the tap until it feels warm, maybe a little warmer than bath water, and they call it good. But warm to your hand and 108 degrees Fahrenheit on a thermometer are two very different things, especially depending on the weather outside or how cold your own hands happen to be that day. Get yourself an inexpensive thermometer, dear, the little instant read kind, and check your water every time you activate yeast. It takes 10 seconds and it will save you more failed loaves than any other single change you could make. The second secret is about the proofing environment itself, meaning the space where your dough actually rises, and this is the part bakeries invest real money in and home bakers almost never think about. A commercial bakery has what's called a proofing cabinet. It's basically a small, warm closet kept at a steady temperature, usually somewhere between 80 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit, with the humidity kept high on purpose, so the surface of the dough never dries out or forms a skin while it rises. That steady, warm, moist environment is a huge part of why bakery dough rises so beautifully and so predictably, batch after batch, day after day. You and I don't have a proofing cabinet in our kitchens, but we can build something close enough to matter, and it costs nothing. Here is what I do, and what I taught my daughter to do, and what she now does in her own kitchen with her own children underfoot. Turn your oven on for about 1 minute, just long enough to take the chill off, then turn it off completely. Place a shallow pan of hot water on the rack below where your dough will sit. Put your covered bowl of dough in that oven with the pan of hot water underneath it and close the door. That little bit of trapped warmth and steam creates a gentle version of what a bakery proofing cabinet does, and your dough will rise faster and more evenly than it would sitting out on your counter in a drafty kitchen. My mother used to do a version of this without ever calling it anything fancy. She would set her dough near the wood stove, close enough to catch the warmth, far enough that it wouldn't overheat, and she always seemed to know exactly the right spot by instinct. I don't have her instinct, if I'm honest with you, dear, so I use the oven trick instead, and it gets me most of the way to what she could do just by feel. Now here's my honest caveat on this one, because I promised you I'd always tell you the truth, not just the flattering parts. This oven and hot water trick is wonderful for a normal loaf of sandwich bread or a batch of dinner rolls. But if you're working with a very delicate and rich dough, something like a brioche with a lot of butter in it, Too much warmth too fast can actually cause the butter to soften and the dough to become greasy and hard to shape. For those doughs, a slower, cooler rise, sometimes even in the refrigerator, actually gives you a better result. So this trick is not a rule for every single dough you'll ever make. It's a rule for most of them, most of the time, and knowing when to set it aside is part of becoming a confident baker rather than a baker who just follows steps blindly. The third secret is the one I promised you at the beginning, the little trick with the rubber band and the jar, and it solves a problem almost every home baker struggles with, which is simply knowing when your dough is actually ready. Most recipes tell you to let your dough rise until it's doubled in size. That sounds precise, but standing over a bowl trying to guess whether something has doubled is much harder than it sounds, especially if you've never seen what doubled actually looks like before you started. Here's what bakeries do, more or less, and what I've adapted for my own kitchen. Take a small clear jar. A little jelly jar works perfectly. After you mix your dough, pinch off a small piece, about the size of a walnut, and drop it into the jar. Press it down flat with 2 fingers so it fills the bottom evenly. Then take a rubber band and wrap it around the outside of the jar, right at the level of the dough. Set that little jar right next to your big bowl of rising dough so they're both experiencing the exact same warmth at the exact same time. That little sample in the jar will rise at essentially the same rate as your big batch of dough because it's made of the exact same dough sitting in the exact same environment. When that little piece in the jar has risen to about double where the rubber band marks it started, your big bowl of dough is ready too. No guessing, no poking around under plastic wrap, no opening your oven door and losing all that carefully built warmth. Just a glance at a little jar sitting on your counter. I started doing this after my granddaughter, who was maybe 7 years old at the time, watched me lifting the plastic wrap off my dough bowl again and again to check on it, and she asked me, quite seriously, "Why don't you just make a little dough in a cup so you don't have to keep bothering the big one?" Out of the mouths of babes, dear, she was exactly right, and I've done it that way ever since. The fourth secret is about patience, and specifically about something bakeries call a cold retard, which is simply a fancy way of saying they let the dough rise slowly in the refrigerator instead of quickly on the counter. Here's why this matters, and here's the part where I get to teach you something that will genuinely change the flavor of your bread, not just the texture. When yeast works quickly, in a warm kitchen, it produces carbon dioxide, which is what makes your dough rise, but it doesn't have much time to develop flavor. When yeast works slowly, in the cold, over many hours, it still produces that same rise, but it also has time to break down starches and proteins in ways that create deeper, more complex flavor. That slightly tangy, slightly nutty taste you get from a really good bakery loaf, the kind that tastes like more than just plain white bread, that's very often coming from a long, slow, cold rise, not from any special ingredient at all. A lot of bakeries mix their dough in the evening, shape it, and let it rise slowly in a walk-in refrigerator overnight, sometimes for as long as 18 hours, and bake it fresh first thing the next morning. That long, cold, unhurried rise is a huge part of why bakery bread tastes the way it does, and it costs the bakery nothing but time. You can do this exact thing in your own refrigerator. After your dough has had its first rise and you've shaped your loaf, instead of letting it do its second rise on the counter for an hour, cover it well and put it in your refrigerator overnight, somewhere around 12 to 18 hours. The next morning, take it out, let it sit on the counter for about 30 minutes to take the chill off, and bake it as you normally would. You will taste the difference, I promise you that. Here's where most people go wrong with this one, and it trips up even fairly experienced bakers. They forget that cold dough still needs a little time to wake back up before it goes into a hot oven. If you pull your dough straight from the refrigerator and put it directly into the oven, it bakes unevenly because the outside of the loaf is already warming while the deep inside is still cold and sluggish. Give it that 30 minutes of rest on the counter first. It makes all the difference between a loaf that bakes evenly all the way through and one that looks done on the outside while still being a bit raw and dense in the very center. The fifth secret, and this one surprises people the most, is about something as ordinary as salt and how you actually put it into your dough. Salt and yeast do not get along, at least not directly. Salt is very good at pulling moisture out of things, and if a grain of salt sits directly against a live yeast cell for very long, it can actually damage or kill that cell before it ever gets the chance to do its job. Bakeries know this so well that it shapes the entire order in which they build their dough. They almost never let salt and yeast touch each other directly in a concentrated way. They mix the yeast into the flour and liquid first, let it get established, and add the salt in a way that it gets distributed evenly through the whole mixture, rather than sitting in a little pile right against the yeast. At home, the mistake looks like this. You measure your yeast into a small bowl to activate it in warm water, and right there on the counter next to it, you've also measured out your salt, and without thinking, you tip the salt into the same little bowl, or you sprinkle it directly on top of your yeast mixture before stirring everything together. That direct contact, especially if the salt sits there for even a minute or two before you stir, can weaken your yeast right at the very start, before your dough has even had a fair chance. The fix costs you nothing and takes no extra time at all. Simply add your salt to your flour and mix your yeast into your warm water and liquid ingredients separately, and only bring the two together when you actually combine everything into dough. That one small change in order, keeping salt and yeast apart until the very last moment, is something my own mother taught me without ever explaining why. She would just say, salt goes in the flour bowl, yeast goes in the water bowl, and never let them meet before their time. I didn't understand the reason behind it until I was well into my 30s, reading about it almost by accident, and I remember feeling almost betrayed that nobody had explained it to me sooner. It isn't complicated. It's just one of those things that gets passed down, or doesn't, depending on whether anybody thought to say it out loud. Now let's talk about what all of this actually means for you, sitting in your own kitchen this week. Think about what a decent loaf of good bakery bread costs these days. In a lot of towns, a single artisan loaf runs you somewhere around $7, sometimes closer to $9 or $10 if it's a specialty bread with seeds or a fancy crust. If your family goes through even 2 loaves a week, and plenty of families do, that adds up to somewhere around $700 a year, just on bread, just for something you could be making in your own kitchen for a small fraction of that cost, using flour, water, salt, and yeast that together might run you less than $1 a loaf. But honestly, dear, the money is only part of it. The real payoff is standing at your own counter, cutting into a loaf you made with your own 2 hands, and having it look and taste like something from that bakery you used to walk past and admire through the window. It's your grandchildren asking for a second slice before they've even finished the first one. It's not needing a recipe anymore because you finally understand why bread does what it does, instead of just following steps and hoping. Here is your homework for this week, and I want you to actually do this one, not just nod along and move on to the next video. Make 1 loaf of a simple yeast bread any basic recipe you already know and trust, and this time, use an actual thermometer to check your water temperature before you activate your yeast, aiming for somewhere between 105 degrees and 110 degrees Fahrenheit. That's it. That's the whole assignment. Just that one change. I think you'll be surprised at the difference. And I'd love to know how it goes. Come back and tell me in the comments what kind of flour you used, and whether it's a bread your own family has been making for generations, or one you're just starting to learn yourself. I read every single one of those comments, every one, and I love hearing about the little traditions in other people's kitchens. It reminds me of my own mother's kitchen, more than you'd probably guess. Next time, I want to show you something my own mother did with her bread dough that saved her real money during years when money was tight for our family, a trick most people have completely forgotten today, and once you see it, you'll wonder why it ever went out of style. Until then, dear, keep your hands a little floury, keep your water thermometer close by, and always give your dough the time it's asking for. This is Rosalie Jean. I'll see you in the next one.